This video is brought to you by Mubi, a curated streaming service showing exceptional films from around the globe. Get a whole month free at mubi.com/BeKindRewind. A lot of people have been asking me what I think of the movie Blonde. Well, I watched it, and it turns out I had a lot more to say about it than I initially anticipated. So despite the fact that I had a whole other video planned for the channel this month, here I am making the internet's 4 millionth video about Andrew Dominik's 2022 film, Blonde. Now, I've made videos in the past responding to current film releases that have to do with Hollywood history. I see those videos as companion pieces, my attempts at giving you more context about the figures and stories depicted, and suggestions for further watching or reading if those films sparked your curiosity. This video is going to be a little different. I want to try to think about this film both on its own terms as an artistic vision and within the context of the biopic boom. Are there comparable films that can help us understand what we're seeing in Blonde? How do Dominik's creative choices inform how we receive information from the film? Speaking of Dominik, what was his intention when creating this film, and does he actually achieve what he set out to achieve? Finally, I want to talk a little bit about where we go from here. Is it even possible to make a good film about Marilyn Monroe? While I don't have the answers to all the questions I ask in this essay, I hope it at least is interesting and gets you thinking about these complicated issues. People who love this film are always first to remind you that it's not a biography, actually. That, in fact, it is a fictionalized account of the life of Marilyn Monroe based on the 700-page novel by writer and sometime Twitter troll Joyce Carol Oates. Called in 2020 The Definitive Study of American Celebrity by The New Yorker, the novel is a beautifully written exploration of stardom and its potential to disempower women. The film, like the novel, does not intend to follow historic fact, nor should we expect it to. In fact, I don't believe that the average viewer expects any biopic, whether it's sold to them as true or not, to be totally factually accurate. Given the restrictions of film as a medium, we naturally anticipate and understand the creation of composite characters, a loss of detail, or the fabrication of situations to represent a larger truth. How else can you tell a comprehensive story in approximately 2 hours? So Blonde gives its authorial and creative license to both Oates and director Andrew Dominik. I think it's important to keep its fictional nature, in mind when we critique it, but also maybe interrogate what that means a little bit. I don't want to spend this video fact-checking Blonde. That's not the point of this film, and many journalists, critics, and a few of my YouTube compatriots have already done this. In general, I'd just say, adopt the following rule of thumb. If in the course of watching this movie you find yourself asking, did that happen? The answer is probably no. She was not in a throuple with Charlie Chaplin Jr. and Edward G. Robinson Jr. She was not raped by Daryl Zanuck, and if her fetus were talking to her, it would have been more like this.
Help. I've gotten stuck on my way to the uterus and am now considered ectopic. That means this pregnancy is medically considered not viable. It's impossible for me to survive or grow into a baby, regardless of whether or not mommy trips on the beach.
Still, I'd like to point out just how blurry and complicated fictionalization can be. While a viewer may approach this film with a healthy amount of skepticism, I'm not sure that it would be entirely obvious to the average viewer just how divorced Blonde is from her biography. Because while the story is fictional, it is trying to feel true in a way that is typical for contemporary biopics. She was sexually abused, she was left in foster care, she did have a series of shitty marriages, just not exactly in the ways depicted here. It's close enough to reality to seem correct, or to be credibly told as a story about Marilyn Monroe. But as I'll discuss later, it's detached enough to feel reductive. Dominik's direction also contributes to that blurring of reality and fiction. This film includes painstakingly accurate recreations of real photographs, costumes, events, and films, even editing Ana de Armas into scenes with Marilyn's original co-stars. He constructed these moments not simply for the sake of comparison, which is by now a tired gimmick of the biopic genre, but to utilize the audience's pre-existing knowledge of Marilyn.
I wanted to sort of, harness the collective memory of her. If you know Marilyn Monroe's life in images, there's so many images in the film that you're going to recognize. The idea, like if you do a Google search of Marilyn Monroe, you'll see all these images from all over the film. And I guess the idea was to sort of trap her within the collective memory.
By grounding these fictional scenes in a very real and familiar time and place, it adds to the perception that we're peeking into some specific moment in her life. It isn't true, but it's wearing the truth's clothing. He could have been making a Sontagian commentary here on the artifice of these photographs, but I don't think he is. All of this is to say, yes, Blonde is not a factual account. It's about the myth of Marilyn Monroe. It's about the image. But can we really divorce Blonde from her real-life iconography? I'm not so sure. In my view, simply labeling something a fictionalized account doesn't mean that story is excused from broader questions about legacy and veracity, particularly when it's released in an entertainment landscape in which it feels like 90% of non-superhero films are biopics that purport to teach audiences something about some misunderstood or under-recognized figure. What does it mean to utilize a real person's life story for your own aims? Does an artist have any responsibilities toward that person? When does something actually become fictionalized? When you add one scene? Two? What do you do in a situation where a person can't consent or respond? Can you just say and do whatever you want? Does it depend on the subject? If it's not Marilyn Monroe, just a symbol that uses all of the characters, films, events, and sets from her life, where should the audiences draw the line in terms of what they expect to see or how she's interpreted? I don't have an answer to those questions, or at least I don't feel confident enough to issue a general conclusion. Dominik, though, seems to approach this issue with remarkable, near-obtuse clarity. When asked for Sight and Sound, do you think there's ever a risk that the audience takes Blonde as gospel truth about Marilyn, even though it's clearly based on a novel, and does it matter? He responded, I don't think that matters. Why would it matter? Regardless of how I feel about fact versus fiction, we have to take the film on its own terms. What exactly was Andrew Dominik trying to say with this film, and does he actually achieve those aims? Obviously, the first thing we have to know to answer those questions is what he claims this film is about. He's given a few answers to this question, some of which contradict each other. Here he is speaking on the Real Blend podcast.
The film's about the meaning of Marilyn Monroe. It's not like it's concerned with what does she mean? Why does she continue to exert a hold over the imagination? Do you know what I mean? Or the collective imagination? That's what it's about. You know, the woman herself is gone. The image remains, and it kind of does hook into it hooks into us in a certain way. And why? What does it mean?
Okay, so what does she mean? Why does she exert a hold on the collective imagination? Why does she hook into us? I have to be honest, I have literally no idea how Blonde answers any of those questions. This framing would seem to require extensive engagement with Marilyn Monroe's work and audience, neither of which this film attempts. Most of the strangers who interact with her are the snarling hounds of the paparazzi who, while actually bad, cannot seriously be expected to represent the millions of people who fell in love with her on screen. Meanwhile, her films are only shown through a contemptuous lens. The set of Some Like It Hot is just another site for trauma. Gentlemen Prefer Blondes spawns nothing but regret. The film is more squarely engaged in her relationships with men, almost all of whom demonstrate some sort of abuse or injustice executed toward her. While that's an important part of Marilyn's story, it doesn't necessarily achieve a broader understanding of Marilyn's grip on American culture. Maybe I'm crazy, but I don't think people were running to the theater because of her intensely Freudian psychology, or because her fetus was haunting her. I think perhaps Dominik gave a more honest answer about his intentions with the film in his interview with Sight and Sound, in which he states that it's about a person who's going to be killing themselves, so it's trying to examine the reasons why they did that. It's not looking at her lasting legacy. I mean, she's not even terribly concerned with any of that stuff. If you look at Marilyn Monroe, she's got everything that society tells us is desirable. She's famous, she's beautiful, she's rich. If you look at the Instagram version of her life, she's got it all. And she killed herself. Now, to me, that's the most important thing. It's not the rest. It's not the moments of strength. Okay, she wrested control away from the men at the studio because, women are just as powerful as men. But that's really looking at it through a lens that's not so interesting to me. I'm more interested in how she feels. I'm interested in what her emotional life was like. I actually do think he successfully does this in Blonde, but here's really the crux of the issue for me. Dominik, who wrote the screenplay, did so quickly, pulling just the scenes he found compelling from the 700-page book. It's not surprising that he picked the ones he did. He wanted to know why a woman would kill herself, so he made a nearly 3-hour movie of unyielding horror, and that's it. The problem is not that the story is fictionalized, the problem is the simplicity and tired execution of that fictionalization. The film ostensibly mourns the over-sexualization of Marilyn and the violence perpetrated against her, but has literally nothing else to show us other than her sexualization and her suffering. The frequency and severity of these scenes tip the film off balance, from an interrogation of the harms experienced by a sex symbol in Hollywood to a near gleeful takedown of a woman who is surely to blame for her misfortune. The character Norma Jean is certainly positioned as culpable for the promiscuity of Marilyn Monroe, either through the deeply weird and semi-irresponsible treatment of her reproductive health or through the way it frames her sexual abuse. It's extraordinarily ironic for a man to discredit her role in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes as romanticized whoredom when he, by authorial choice, filmed this same woman in multiple sex and rape scenes and placed his camera inside her literal cervix. This reminded me of the quote from which Amanda Konkel's book, Some Kind of Mirror, Creating Marilyn Monroe, takes its name. In 1954, Monroe wrote, "People had a habit of looking at me as if I were some kind of mirror instead of a person. They didn't see me, they saw their own lewd thoughts. Then they white-masked themselves by calling me the lewd one." I spoke to Konkel, who is an associate professor at Georgia Southern University, about her book and how apt this quote seems now.
What I was trying to do in the book was to say, this image of Monroe as this projection of everyone else's sexual fantasies is like one small part of her persona. And all of these other things she did were actually attempts to counteract that or contradict that part of her persona. But this film definitely jumps off on what lewd thoughts can we project onto this figure, and what can we then cement in audiences' minds by having it dramatized on the screen.
Angelica Bastian notes in her review for Vulture, why are women so often called to represent things rather than be things in film? Woman is a myth, is a representation of Hollywood's depravity, of the totalizing nature of white women's victimhood, of the nature of womanhood itself, which is to suffer, of course, but never herself. This is indeed a through line in Marilyn's posthumous life, this series of male artists who use her as a symbol, or, less generously, who find a way to make themselves the center of her suffering. As a sex symbol who is also known for her extreme vulnerability, Marilyn is apparently available to their manipulation and interpretation. They're entitled to her. In my video about the Misfits, I talk about her relationship with playwright Arthur Miller, who, despite being portrayed as the nice husband in Blonde, is perhaps the foremost perpetrator of this. After their divorce, he wrote After the Fall, a play that is so obviously about his relationship with Monroe that one cannot even describe it as thinly veiled. Miller has a measurable degree of sympathy for her, but the work is clearly through his lens, meant to unpack how he dealt with her status as a sex symbol. He recognizes that she is treated like a piece of meat, but realizes his hypocrisy because he knows he can be just as bad as the men who leer at her. Fame destroys her, and she is punished in kind, dying by her own hand, an ending he wrote before she actually did. He did this again in his last play, Finishing the Picture, in which another not-so-thinly veiled Marilyn character spends virtually the entire play naked in bed, refusing to work, and falling to her addictions. Again, we're asked to watch her suffer and wonder who is to blame. My Week with Marilyn is a far more successful film than Blonde, but nevertheless follows this pattern. Colin Clark, a production assistant on The Prince and the Showgirl, tells us about the brief but dazzling time he spent with Monroe. She's a fantasy, albeit a sometimes complicated one. She struggles again, but remains an enchanting character who prompts his awakening and his maturity. Blonde, though originally written by a woman who, by the way, has her own very strange ideas, took its visual shape through Andrew Dominik, who also, by admission, is more interested in the ideas Marilyn Monroe conjures than he is in her. He told Deadline, "I always wanted to do a story about childhood trauma and how that shapes an adult's perception of the world, to make a film from within a person's mythology. My original idea was to do that for a serial killer, but when I read Blonde, I thought, well, I could do this with an actress and it should be slightly more sympathetic." I began thinking about this film in the context of other fictionalized biopics of so-called tragic women that have come out in recent years, specifically Spencer and Judy. Judy, based on the play Over the Rainbow, has a much glossier Hollywood biopic feel than Blonde. While it doesn't necessarily paint a rosy picture of Garland, it for the most part avoids the grimmest details of her final days. As I mentioned in my video about that movie, Judy was not doing well at this point in her life. Her voice sounded powerful, but injured. She was severely underweight, and by all accounts was often unable to function because of the severity of her addictions. Still, Renee Zellweger's voice is scraped clean of any wobbles or decay. She retains her muscly celebrity arms, and the film ends not with Judy's death, but with an ostensibly heartwarming rendition of Somewhere Over the Rainbow. To me, this is Blonde's extreme opposite, a woman's untimely death smoothed into a heartwarming ending so as not to disturb the audience. Frankly, I couldn't help but find this ending a bit too neat or disingenuous. However, I appreciated that the film so consciously avoided the instinct to exploit or scandalize this woman. After all, hadn't she suffered enough already? Spencer is spiritually much more similar to Blonde than Judy is. Using surreal and horror-adjacent elements, it attempts to expose the psychological torture imposed on Princess Diana by an institution that seeks to control her. Very Marilyn. Like Blonde, Spencer can also be uncomfortable to watch, although I'd argue the shock of her story was somewhat blunted by The Crown depicting these exact same behaviors the year prior. Interestingly, despite this film wanting us to revel in the despair of Diana's life, Spencer also chooses not to dwell on her death, ending instead on a somewhat hopeful note, with her driving away, blasting the radio, and dancing with her sons. A vision of some alternate timeline where she could be free. I'll be honest, I didn't like Judy or Spencer that much. Sorry. But they didn't leave me with an awful taste in my mouth, and I've been trying to parse out why Blonde felt different. I think it's because these films understand that there is a reason people like these women. The filmmakers want to show us, for example, that Diana was a kind woman and a good mother, that Judy was a talented entertainer who connected with the gay community. Through fictionalized stories, they reinforce the reason that we ever cared about these women in the first place, in addition to the grisly details that made their deaths so unfortunate and surreal. Blonde, on the other hand, is relentless. It's 5 minutes into the film before she's physically abused, and it doesn't stop until she dies. Yes, a wide smile and a happy song can seem like a disingenuous rendering of a sad story, but so can the opposite. Are we really supposed to believe that trauma and abuse are the sole themes governing Marilyn Monroe's life? That she experienced no joy or took no pride in her work? At what point does it become an exercise in exploitation? I think my philosophy just fundamentally differs from Dominik's on this. To him, pain is the point. Dominik did do a lot of research on Monroe in preparation for this film. He's seen the movies, and in contrast to his more viral interview quotes, I've found several instances in which he has very complimentary things to say about Marilyn as an actress. He also demonstrates a keen understanding of the influence and agency she exerted on her own career in real life. He knows these things. He just doesn't see them as relevant to the story he wants to tell. He told Deadline, for example, studio boss Daryl F. Zanuck never liked her, never knew what to do with her, so she very much did self-actualize, which we don't show in the film. I'm not sure that Joyce is terribly interested in that. I certainly wasn't as interested in that. Obviously, because this is based on a novel, we can't lay all the responsibility for this at Dominik's feet. Based, at least, on her Twitter feed, Joyce Carol Oates seems to think that people who don't agree with the film's portrayal of Marilyn Monroe are arguing that she was a comic, one-dimensional, sexy glamour lady who loved diamonds. She is still amazed that people wish to think that a person who takes her own life out of despair is actually a seductive blonde lady in pink satin and 3-inch shoes cooing boop boop be-doo to handsome men in black tie. Aside from the fact that I don't think anyone is actually arguing that, the issue here is that she cannot fathom a person being both. She takes two literal descriptions of Marilyn Monroe and sets them against each other, as if to say one must be false. You are either a tragic figure or a sex symbol, Norma Jean or Marilyn Monroe. The two are mutually exclusive, although of course that's not how being a human works.
This double persona is a big part of the myth around Monroe. And a lot of the early fan magazines and biographies, like studio biographies, also emphasize like she's two different people. At the studio and on film, she's the sex symbol, but at home, she's quiet and shy and reserved and hardworking. And initially, the studios were trying to do that, I think, to dial back the sex symbol aspect of her persona and create that sympathy for her. But that's always been part of the story. But what I see in her performances is bringing that shyness, that sensitivity, like even in the real stinker roles, you can still see what we might associate as echoes of the Norma Jean persona, right? The mistreated child or the sensitive adult. That still comes through in the film performances for me. And so I think there's this effort to like reduce her humanity to like an either or kind of thing, when really those two aspects for me and more seem intertwined in like one complex human being who also happen to be a performer and have a public persona in ways that people are reluctant to recognize, I think. It's easier to talk about an either or than it is to talk about all of these things being wrapped up together into a complex human being.
When thinking about this division between Marilyn and Norma, I also began thinking about another quote-unquote busty blonde who sometimes refers to herself in the third person as a character she created, Dolly Parton. Dolly has for decades explained her aesthetic as both a genuine expression of how she wants to look, but also as a strategy, a gimmick that makes her memorable and recognizable. She tells us that she keeps some aspects of Dolly and the entertainer separate from Dolly the person. So why is it so much more comfortable to hear Dolly refer to herself in the third person than it is to hear Marilyn do it? My instinctive answer to that question is that Dolly was/is not taken advantage of in the ways Marilyn was. She has control. Dolly is not only known as a great singer-songwriter, but also as a savvy businesswoman. Her look is highly merchandisable, she's ventured into nearly every area of commerce, and has strategically broadened her audience to become one of the most popular entertainers of all time. Because this is so widely known, we can comfortably imagine this woman approaching herself as partially, for better or worse, a brand that requires some level of detachment. When Marilyn refers to herself in the third person, it's painfully jarring precisely because control is almost always what is subtracted from her narrative. It's a behavior that has no other explanation than to be a result of trauma. Mental turmoil cleaved her psyche in two irreconcilable identities. Although she was heavily involved in shaping her look and later in her career in the types of films she was making and how they were sold, we are very rarely told that story by filmmakers. To be clear, Marilyn never wielded full control, not in the way Dolly does, and she was not a mentally healthy woman. But it's, in my mind, more interesting to examine how much control she could exert and when, and how that business sense might have clashed with her goals as an artist. For example, how does a person go from making The Misfits, a film that she helped get off the ground in order to explicitly subvert her sexy bombshell persona, to the set of what would have been her final film, Something's Gotta Give, in which she personally suggested doing this pool scene semi-nude because it would be a good way to market the movie? That film was never completed, but does anyone think she would have been wrong? What is that like, to not necessarily want to use sex sells as a driving principle of your celebrity, but also to so easily be able to employ it, to naturally sense the demands of the marketplace, to not even be afraid to go there when necessary, and to make all of those choices yourself? To forsake nuances like this is valid on its own terms for a film in which tragedy is the centerpiece. Still, I can't help but want to ask this film for more, a more compelling narrative that foregrounds the scope and limits of her choices, rather than bluntly hammering home the facile point that bad things happening can make a person sad. Both Joyce Carol Oates and Dominik seem averse to this interpretation of Monroe because to them, presenting her as anything other than this overwhelmingly tragic figure must be an unnecessary woke feminist reframing. They're smart enough not to phrase it that way, lest they be mistaken for Republicans, but both react to the criticism that she's portrayed as too weak or broken by bringing that sentiment into the conversation. There's a sense that we want to reinvent her according to today's political concerns, he told Sight and Sound, but she was a person who was extraordinarily self-destructive. Again, either or. To Deadline, he said it more bluntly, any person that's killing themselves is not a figure of female empowerment. As much as we want to reinvent Marilyn Monroe as the female du jour, I don't think that that's responsible. To their credit, there have been biopics that have come out recently that are obvious and annoying attempts at capturing the liberal zeitgeist and should never have been framed that way. But I don't think they're actually pushing back against that kind of film, so much as they are fundamentally incapable of accepting that mental turmoil and admiration can coexist. She struggled, she killed herself, period, end of story. He also couches his criticisms of these concerns in the idea of protection, specifically that fans perpetuate the dangerous idea of needing to protect Marilyn. He told The Wrap, it's all written with this feeling that I understood her, I alone, and if I was there, this wouldn't have happened. I think you also see it in the people that dislike the film, because they're also trying to rescue her. They're just trying to rescue her from me. But I think that when you have a desire to rescue somebody, probably the person they need most rescuing from is you. People feel very protective of her, and I think that's part of the problem. I think that's part of the reason why she's dead. I find this quote contradictory and extremely manipulative. The film is filled with characters who are uninterested in protecting her, but who are also explicitly framed as contributing to her death. So which is it? At the same time, I understand what he's trying to say because I recognize that instinct in myself. I do want to rescue her from him. Why is it this film stirred up so much anger in me? Why do I have this desire to see a less grueling portrait of this woman I can never even know? The less generous answer, and probably the one that trolls are leaving in the comment section right now, is that you're just a pussy who can't handle seeing dark shit on screen. Art isn't meant to make you feel nice and cozy all the time. Get over it. However, I don't really think that's the case. Protect, to me, doesn't mean bury the ugly aspects of her life. No story about Marilyn Monroe will ever be a predominantly comfortable one, and it would be dishonest to censor that. Protect, to me, means just try a little bit harder to be fair to your subject, to not put needlessly demeaning words in her mouth, or limit her emotional toolbox to exclude joy or anger. Filmmakers need not have empathy or sympathy for the characters in their films, but I do think good filmmakers at least try to make their protagonists fully formed human beings, not avatars for suffering. I suppose to wrap up my thoughts on Blonde, well, I didn't like it. In a sense, I do think Andrew Dominik was successful with this film in that he said he didn't want to explore any of the interesting things about Marilyn Monroe, and he didn't. It's not nearly as smart about its subject as it wants you to believe, nor do its many visual devices add anything remotely insightful. It is sometimes lyrical in a way that I admittedly found beautiful, but I could not get over how bizarrely literal much of its visual language is, to the point that it reads like a Symbolism 101 textbook. JFK's orgasm is accompanied by comically obvious phallic images like the Washington Monument, and Marilyn's, well, the bed turning into a waterfall, that was an idea I had because we were going into Niagara, and it's her first orgasm, and it should be like Niagara Falls. It was too good to ignore. I simply think this is corny. It looks like an interesting transition, but it's unclever, surface-level symbolism nevertheless, which is actually a pretty good representation of this film in general. As my good friend Spencer said, Dominik is like a cat walking over a piano. There's a lot going on at once, and though he had the right tools, he wasn't exactly making music. To conclude this video, I'd like to turn things back over to Amanda Conkle, who I asked what she'd want most people to know about Marilyn Monroe and how one might approach her work for the first time.
I think one of the most important things for people to recognize about Marilyn Monroe is that she was a hardworking actress, and that gets overshadowed because she did it so well that people assumed she wasn't acting, that she was just stupid, and that she was just a sex symbol. And so for people to see that she was actually acting, I think there are a couple of films that I would recommend looking at kind of in comparison to one another. And both of them are films that a lot of audiences respond to well. I think, of course, I would ask people to look at Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and see how that persona is crafted, but also how captivating Monroe is in the stage performances, even with the very simple dance moves. And to know that she was singing those songs, besides the operatic part at the beginning of Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend, she was singing all of those songs herself. She was learning those dances. And so that's a whole performance that's very difficult to give. And then I like for people to see that in contrast with the Misfits, which is usually a film that people either love or hate. But I think it shows more of that sensitivity to people's expectations for the persona and how Monroe in that performance continually challenges those expectations and asks people to see that she doesn't have to be the happy girl. She doesn't have to be Marilyn Monroe all the time. Sometimes she can be frustrated or unhappy, and that's okay. And seeing those two performances in contrast, they're very different, and they show her range as an actor and performer and how she grew as a performer over, a 9-year period.
I've uploaded this interview in full to my Patreon. If you'd like to hear more of our conversation and are interested in supporting the channel, please consider subscribing. I've left a link in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you again to Mubi for sponsoring this video. Mubi is a curated streaming service showing exceptional films from around the globe, all handpicked by Mubi's curators. Every day, Mubi premieres a new film. From iconic directors to emerging auteurs, there's always something new to discover. It's like your own personal film festival streaming anytime, anywhere. As I've said before, Mubi is one of my favorite platforms. It has such a unique selection. Right now, their Halloween offerings are different from anything you'll find on any other service, so you really have to check it out. But today I want to talk about Notebook. Notebook is a print-only magazine devoted to the art and culture of cinema, created, prepared, and published by Mubi. It's published biannually. It's a yearly subscription that includes 2 beautiful issues. Each issue comes with an exclusive gift, a surprise, just for its subscribers. Shipping is free wherever you are. Issue 1 of the Notebook magazine features original contributions by artists, writers, filmmakers, and scholars about a unique and eclectic array of cinematic subjects, including sections devoted to new openings around the world, theaters, galleries, and exhibition venues, and cinematic beginnings approached from unexpected angles. I personally loved this interview with Maya Cade about the Black Film Archive. It's harder and harder to find print resources that talk about film in a really interesting way and that look really beautiful. So I think this is just such a unique opportunity to hear from really interesting thinkers about what's going on in cinema today. You can now find issue 1 in select stores around the world, and subscriptions are now open for issues 2 and 3. You can subscribe to the magazine now for $40 a year. Find out more at mubi.com/magazine, and don't forget to check the link in my bio for a whole month of great cinema free on Mubi.
Marilyn, what's the best part you ever had in a movie?
Well, one of the best parts I've ever had was in the Asphalt Jungle, John Huston's picture, and then 7-Year Itch with, Billy Wilder's picture.
You think that's going to be a big one too, don't you?
Pardon?
You think that's going to be a big one too, don't you, the 7-Year Itch?
Yes, I think it'll be a very good picture, and I would like to continue making this type of picture.
Well, now, what's the smallest part you ever had?
2 I can think of. One in a picture called Ticket to Tomahawk. I had one word. Well, not exactly a word. I said,